Switch off the mic, turn on the power. That is from Don Chow, President of Vietnam Gas. Commenting on the issues concerning Kenya, using the president's visit to China. This Vietnamese guy has said everything a guy would say about a failed system. Vijana wanasema ametuchongoa sana. Chow says the problem with Kenya is not money. Kenya has money. Remember, he's saying this in reference to the president's tour in China. And the president is in China specifically to borrow money. But this gentleman says, you have the money. So then the question we must ask is, why is Ruto going to borrow money from China for projects, yet we have the money here? Let me try and answer that. One, and he mentions the issue of vision, I'll come back to that later. Sometimes the leadership is so inept. Sometimes the leadership is preoccupied with useless things. Sometimes the leadership spends all the time listening to useless people, that the leadership may not have the time to assess the problem in the country. And a country like that, where leadership has no time to assess the problem or the problems in the country, solutions may be thought of as impossible. So yes, do our leaders have the capacity from 1963? Do they have the time to focus on this country and on the problems facing this country and therefore look for solutions, including knowing that there is money? Maybe they don't have the time, they don't have the focus, they don't have the capacity, and therefore money may be here, as the Vietnamese guy says, but our people may not even know there is money here. That explains why we believe in this country. The leadership of this country believes you can only raise money through taxation and through borrowing. And that is a fat lie. There are many other ways of raising money. God has endowed us with resources under the earth and above the earth, in the skies and in the waters that God has given us. Have we ever thought about raising money from those sources? The resources that God has given us. So that in our small thinking, government can only raise money from taxation and from borrowing. So Cho is right in a way. The second reason why we can go and borrow, yet we have money, is because the money we have here is for stealing. After theft, what we people call corruption, not enough is left for a project. So the problem is. So the money available is stolen, is for stealing. We talk about budget padding. We talk about budgeted corruption. So that all the money around is for stealing. It cannot remain to do the SGR. And that's why we must go to China to borrow money. The third reason why we may be borrowing is because we are going to borrow money from China so that we can steal it. Not because we need it. No. We are borrowing money to put it in a project so that we can steal it. Because almost every project in this country is a scheme by people to steal. Even micro examples, if you walk, I'm a teacher and I keep giving examples about education and schools. If you go to a school, drive past, walk in, and you see there is a gate being constructed, a huge gate, please, it is not because that school needs that gate. It's because the principal wants to send money to London where the daughter is for fees. That's why the project of the gate and the stone walling. It's not because the school needs it. So we go and borrow in China so that we may start projects and steal from those projects. It's not far-fetched. The first SGR, we are told, was greatly exaggerated in cost. The quality of the services, the trains themselves, for that amount of money, other countries have done more kilometers, better trains themselves, the wagons and the engines. For less amount of money, other countries have done electrical trains. Therefore, we were shortchanged, even in terms of just quality. We have it on authority of Jimmy Wanjigi. And Jimmy Wanjigi is not just your average Joe. He's a man who could become your president in 2027. He says, and that's why he differed with the men he had helped seriously put in government. That's why he differed with Uhuru and Ruto, because Jimmy Wanjigi says he had everything planned for this country to have that SGR at a much lower cost than it eventually cost. Secondly, the people who are coming to construct the SGR were not asking this country for 1 shilling. I may be missing a few points here and there, but the principle is we were not going to borrow to construct the first original SGR. Then why did we abandon a plan like that was going to cost us nothing? Because it had to be a project for people to eat. And if anybody says I'm wrong, wants to jump on my back, before you criticize me, please table the original contract for SGR. President William Ruto promised us the moment he becomes president, he will table that SGR contract. To date, to the best of my knowledge, he has not done. The complicit media in this country has not helped. Nobody has asked President Ruto to help us see the original contract of SGR. The late President John Pombe Magufuli of Tanzania came to power and he found contracts on the table for signature. These Chinese contracts. Magufuli said, only a madman can sign such a contract. You surrender your sovereignty, you surrender your rights, you are given the most ridiculous offers in the contract. Magufuli alisema mwenda wazimu peke yake anaweza weka sahihi katika kandarasi kama hiyo. So yes, I'm right when I say we are bringing up new projects not because we need them, but most likely because people want to eat from those contracts. Excuse me. Ask yourself, has anybody told us how the extension of the SGR will be of economic benefit? Is there a business case for it, even the initial SGR? I read somewhere with amusement, somebody was saying, he was responding to people who are arguing that we don't need that extension to Kisumu and Malaba. And somebody was saying, and I really laughed, that in fact there will be more business for the train to Kisumu because Westerners travel a lot more. Look at that nonsense. Trains cannot realize profit because of passengers. You cannot start a train service with the passengers in mind. In fact, passenger trains like in Europe were started to help the public to ease transport problem, not to make money. You cannot make money from train service if you are relying on passengers. So if you ask these guys who are in China to borrow money to extend SGR, how will they ever make money? How will SGR earn money? Let me not use the word make. They have no idea. When they started the original SGR, they even forced people. They forced transporters, people doing business, transporting goods, not to use trucks. But quick calculation by the businessmen told government, look here, it's much more easier to use a truck than your train. And this brings me to what Cho is saying again about vision. He says the problem with this country springs from lack of vision. You cannot develop a country without a vision. When UDA, Kenya Kwanza, came up with what they call a plan, I was on some television stage and I said this is nonsense. A plan is the third entry, third stage. You start with a vision. A man aspiring to be president must have a vision for the country. And then, with the help of experts and other thinkers, and the men in politics around him, you come up with a manifesto which is a concrete realization of that vision. And then the plan is an implementation strategy being drawn from the manifesto. And that's why Kenya Kwanza got it wrong from the word go. And we are paying for it. Cho says, we have no vision. And we pursue short-term gains. He's just being polite to us. He's saying your leaders pursue simple things like becoming rich, primitive accumulation. That's what they do. Instead of thinking about your country 100, 200 years to come, you are thinking about making billions. This is how we started immediately after independence. All African leaders, with the exception of one or two, Nyerere, Sekou Toure, and a few, one or two, three others, everybody else started accumulating wealth. Primitive accumulation. Tracts of land. I don't know what and what. That's what this Cho man is saying. You cannot develop a country if the leadership of that country is pursuing narrow things like primitive accumulation of wealth, competing among each other who has the most billions, to even the most ridiculous levels of who wears the most expensive shirt. And under the sole of your shoe, people can see is a designer shoe. That kind of leadership cannot produce development for a country. Cho tells us that you cannot be roaming the country. When he says switch off the mic, what is he saying? They know, and I've said this repeatedly, the people we go to meet, the investors we go to meet across Europe, America, China, everywhere. When an African president is going to China or wherever they are going to seek loans and investment opportunities, these guys do a thorough search of what we are, what we do, what preoccupies us. So by the time President Ruto is going to China, people already know in the past 3 weeks he has spent all the time in the villages of this country, just talking. Instead of sitting down to develop the country, he's moving around the country. You have been in Mount Kenya for like 5-6 days. Before that, you are don't know where for 3, 4, 5 days. And after that trip, you are going to another place for another 6, 7 days. For heaven's sake, switch off the mics. Stop meandering the country and roaming the country. Sit down in State House. Sit down in Harambee House. Sit down with experts. Figure out how to develop this country. Figure out how to raise resources from here instead of going to borrow. And remember the shame that borrowing brings. The terms you are given. Excuse me. That's what this guy is saying. Switch off the mic. Stop talking. Stop roaming the country. And then after that you are going to beg. Sit down and figure out how you can get solutions. How you can get resources from within this country. How you can partner with other countries. Not go and beg from them. You partner with them. Switch off the mic. He says, I met the president and Mudavadi. They talked so well. But behind the good English, the good words, there's emptiness. There's nothing. You cannot talk development when you don't have reliable electricity. In many parts of this country, the slightest sign of rainfall, when rain is just beginning to fall, power goes off. People have lived in America, Kenyans, 20, 10, 15 years. They have never seen power failure. He gives the example of Vietnam, a country with 100 million people, producing 70 gigawatts of electricity. Kenya, with half that population, 50 million and above, 4. Instead of 35, or even 30, even 25, 4. How then can you talk of investors coming here, manufacturers? You don't have sufficient electricity. It is not reliable. Why is it not sufficient? Why is it not reliable? Because energy is where corruption lives. Corruption resides in the energy sector. That's where people have made their billions. And I can name them 1, 2, 3, up to 5. If somebody ever dares me, I'll name all of them, including very sensitive names. You cannot produce electricity for this country. Just look at those independent power producers' contracts. You'll die with shame. You'll die with, if you are a Kenyan like me who loves this country, you'll just collapse in shame and die. And somebody there, I am engaged elsewhere. And I was telling people we can terminate some of these lousy contracts. People are saying there are always consequences. Of course there are consequences of walking out of a contract. But sometimes it's better to walk out of a stupid contract than continue with it. Having looked at those independent power production contracts, I have seen many exits we can use to walk out of those contracts. And I'm not a lawyer. How about good lawyers? They will see more. So, I have seen these views from Don Chu circulating in the country. I just hope ametuchokora ya kutosha. I just hope this Cho guy has pricked our conscience, has touched we Kenyans somewhere, that we have it within our own boundaries. And the national anthem, as Raila always says, plenty be found within our borders. That was not an empty phrase. Plenty be found within our borders. And indeed, God in his own wisdom has put enough within our borders. And Don Cho is telling us we don't have to embarrass ourselves begging, because we have enough here. Look at the beauty of this country. Ask yourself, there's a story again circulating in the media, it's been done for about 2-3 weeks, about a country that discovered oil at the same time with another country. I can't remember the details. I'm a bit under the weather, so I'm not thinking very straight. So the two countries, both of them discovering oil. One is a Scandinavian country, I think. One embarked on saving. The other one on wanton consumption. Today, the one that embarked on saving, a few decades later, has so much money is lending out. In fact, the Chinese secret is when people thought China was so closed, China was demonic, China was dictatorial, China had no democratic space. When people thought that, China had embarked on a phase of saving. When we didn't know much about China, except what America was telling us about China, China was saving. Until it got to a place where using the savings and the investment in education and technology, it began to shock the world. And before the world could recover from the shock of a gigantic China, we were all going to beg China. We were all taking loans from China, including America. So yes, Don Chow is right. Within the borders of every country, God has given that country resources to use to develop. China, with that huge population, used internal resources to build a saving that is beyond the envy of even America. We must end by saying, let's switch off the mic. And I've said this repeatedly. I've asked the president, can you please stop moving around the country for only 6 months? Sit down in Harambee House. Let people see the presidential standard. We used to see it and we knew Moi was there in Harambee House. When you see the presidential standard, another flag other than the Kenyan flag, unajua president ako Harambee House. Because the moment he enters, the presidential standard begins to there. Let us see that presidential standard at Harambee House to signal that the president, our president, is sitting down to address the issues facing this country. Let State House be a place where people engage in serious business, not where busybodies go and gossip. Let the president keep off his buddies who add no value when they go to State House. Let him let them leave the president to work for this country. We have carried this shame for over 60 years. We have carried this shame for far too long. The shame of a rich country endowed with all the riches you can think of, begging across the world. The shame of the people of this country begging and dying of hunger and of every imaginable disease, like Chinua Achebe would say. It no longer is. This shame must come to an end. If it takes a Vietnamese to tell us, so be it.